When wildlife photographer Rachel Morrison witnessed a massive python attacking a defenseless Mustang foal in the remote Nevada desert, every instinct told her to stay back and let nature take its course. But what she did next would not only save the foal's life, but trigger the most shocking response from a wild Mustang herd ever captured on camera. Rachel's split-second decision to risk everything for a baby horse she'd never met would lead to an extraordinary display of gratitude that challenged everything experts knew about wild horse behavior and proved that heroism recognizes no boundaries between species. Rachel Morrison crouched behind a cluster of sagebrush, her telephoto lens focused on the Mustang herd grazing peacefully in the Nevada wilderness. The 34-year-old wildlife photographer had spent 2 weeks documenting the Calico Mountains Mustangs for National Geographic, her auburn hair tied back practically and her weathered hands steady despite hours of patient observation. Perfect lighting, Rachel whispered into her voice recorder, capturing images of the lead stallion, a magnificent bay Mustang with distinctive white markings across his chest. The herd consisted of 14 horses, including several mares with young foals, creating exactly the family dynamics her assignment required. Rachel wore her standard desert gear, khaki pants, long-sleeve shirt for sun protection, and hiking boots designed for the rocky terrain. Her camera equipment, worth more than most people's cars, hung from a specialized harness that allowed quick adjustments while maintaining stability for the long-distance shots her magazine demanded. The morning had been productive, with Rachel documenting complex social interactions between the Mustangs that would illustrate her article about wild horse family structures. But as she prepared to change positions for different angles, something in her peripheral vision made her freeze completely. A massive Burmese python, at least 18 feet long and thick as a telephone pole, was moving through the sparse desert vegetation with deadly purpose. The snake's presence in Nevada was completely impossible. These constrictors belonged in Southeast Asia, not the American West. Yet there it was, very real and heading directly toward a young Mustang foal that had wandered slightly away from the herd. What the hell? Rachel breathed, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Burmese pythons didn't exist in Nevada's wild ecosystem. The snake had to be an escaped or released exotic pet, now turned into an apex predator in an environment with no natural defenses against it. The foal, a beautiful paint with black and white markings, was no more than 3 months old. Too young to recognize the approaching danger, the baby horse continued grazing while the massive serpent closed the distance with terrifying efficiency. Rachel's photographer instincts warred with her human compassion as she watched the python prepare to strike. Professional protocol demanded that she document natural predation without interference, but everything about this situation was unnatural, an invasive predator attacking native wildlife that had no evolutionary experience with such threats. The adult Mustangs were too far away to intervene in time. The lead stallion had noticed something was wrong, his head raised in alert position, but the python's approach was hidden by the terrain. By the time the herd could react, the foal would already be caught in the snake's deadly coils. Rachel found herself in an impossible position. She could document what would likely be the first recorded python predation of a wild Mustang in North America, or she could abandon her professional objectivity and try to save a baby horse from a completely unnatural death. The python struck with lightning speed, its massive coils wrapping around the foal's legs as the baby horse screamed in terror. In that moment, Rachel made the decision that would change her life forever and shock the entire wildlife photography community. Rachel dropped her expensive camera equipment and sprinted toward the python attack, abandoning years of professional training that demanded wildlife photographers never interfere with natural predation. But nothing about this situation was natural. A Burmese python had no business in the Nevada desert, and she couldn't watch an invasive species kill a native animal. "Hey, get away from him!" Rachel shouted at the massive snake, grabbing a dead branch as she ran toward the struggling foal. The python had wrapped its powerful coils around the baby horse's front legs and was beginning the slow crushing process that would kill the foal within minutes. The foal's terrified screams echoed across the desert, alerting the Mustang herd to the crisis. Rachel could hear the thunderous approach of hoofbeats as the adult horses realized one of their young was in mortal danger, but they were still too far away to help. Rachel reached the python just as it began tightening its grip on the foal. Using the branch like a club, she struck at the snake's head while trying to position herself to unwrap the deadly coils. The python immediately recognized Rachel as a threat, releasing part of its grip on the foal to defend itself against this unexpected attack. "Come on, baby, fight!" Rachel urged the foal as she battled the 18-foot serpent. The python's head, thick as her thigh, swiveled toward her with cold calculation. These snakes were capable of killing adult humans, and Rachel knew she was risking her life for a foal she'd never seen before. The snake struck at Rachel with lightning speed, its massive jaws missing her by inches as she threw herself backward. The brief distraction allowed the foal to struggle free from the loosened coils, but the baby horse's legs were damaged and it couldn't run to safety. Rachel found herself between the python and the injured foal, armed with nothing but a stick against one of nature's most efficient predators. The snake coiled for another strike, this time at Rachel, as it decided she was the primary threat that needed to be eliminated. That's when the ground began to shake with approaching hoofbeats. The led stallion arrived like a force of nature, his powerful body launching into the air as he struck at the python with hooves that could crush bones. The massive horse's arrival changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. But instead of focusing solely on the snake, the stallion did something that shocked Rachel to her core. He positioned himself protectively over both Rachel and the injured foal, treating the human who had risked her life as part of his family unit that needed defending. The other Mustangs arrived in a coordinated charge that would have terrified any predator. But their behavior toward Rachel was what left her speechless. Instead of seeing her as an additional threat to drive away, they included her in their protective formation around the injured foal. "They're protecting me too," Rachel whispered in amazement as the Mustang mares formed a defensive circle that included her within their family group. The horses seemed to understand that Rachel had risked her life to save their baby, and they were responding with acceptance and protection she had never seen wild horses show toward humans. The python, faced with 14 angry horses, led by a stallion willing to fight to the death, began its retreat. The massive snake had learned that this particular prey wasn't worth the battle against such determined opposition. As the immediate danger passed, Rachel knelt beside the injured foal, checking for broken bones while the mother mare stood protectively over both of them. The baby horse was hurt but alive, thanks to Rachel's intervention and the herd's coordinated response. But the most shocking part was yet to come as the Mustangs prepared to show their gratitude in ways that would redefine everything Rachel thought she knew about wild horse intelligence and emotion. The injured foal struggled to stand on trembling legs as Rachel gently examined his wounds. The python's constriction had caused significant bruising and possible soft tissue damage, but miraculously, no bones appeared to be broken. The baby Mustang, whom Rachel immediately thought of as brave for his fighting spirit, looked up at her with trusting dark eyes that nearly brought tears to her face. "Easy, little one," Rachel soothed, using techniques she'd learned from years of wildlife photography to keep frightened animals calm. "You're going to be okay." What happened next defied every piece of scientific literature Rachel had ever read about wild horse behavior. The mother mare, instead of driving Rachel away from her injured foal, gently nuzzled Rachel's shoulder in what could only be interpreted as gratitude and acceptance. The lead stallion approached slowly, his massive head lowered in a gesture that Rachel recognized as non-threatening communication. When he extended his muzzle toward her hand, Rachel held perfectly still, understanding she was experiencing something unprecedented in human wild horse interactions. "He's thanking me," Rachel whispered in amazement as the stallion gently touched her palm with his nose. "This wild Mustang is actually expressing gratitude for saving his foal." The entire herd gathered around Rachel and Brave in a formation that wildlife experts would later describe as a ceremony of acceptance. Each adult horse approached Rachel individually, touching her with gentle nose bumps and soft nickering sounds that clearly conveyed approval and welcome. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a Mustang behavior specialist who would later review Rachel's footage, explained the significance. Wild Mustangs never include humans in their social structures. What Rachel captured represents a complete paradigm shift in how we understand wild horse intelligence and emotional capacity. Rachel's camera equipment had survived her hasty abandonment, and she was able to document the extraordinary behavior as the Mustangs demonstrated their acceptance. The footage would later become some of the most important wildlife behavioral documentation ever recorded. Brave's mother began teaching Rachel how to properly support the injured foal, guiding Rachel's hands with gentle nudges and showing her the correct positioning to help the baby horse stand. The educational exchange between species was unlike anything documented in wild horse research. "She's teaching me," Rachel realized as the mare demonstrated specific techniques for helping Brave move without causing additional pain. "This wild horse is showing me how to care for her baby." The stallion took on the role of protector for the entire group, positioning himself to watch for returning threats, while allowing Rachel complete access to tend to Brave's injuries. His trust in a human was completely contrary to normal wild Mustang behavior. As the day progressed, Rachel found herself functioning as an accepted member of the herd. The horses included her in their movement patterns, waited for her when changing grazing locations, and maintained protective formations that kept her safely within their group structure. "I'm part of their family now," Rachel documented in her voice notes. "These wild horses have adopted me as a permanent member of their herd because I saved their baby." The most remarkable moment came when Brave struggled to nurse due to his injuries. The mother mare looked directly at Rachel and then at her struggling foal, clearly requesting help. Rachel carefully supported Brave's weight, allowing him to nurse successfully while his mother stood patiently. By evening, Brave was moving much better, but the herd showed no inclination to exclude Rachel from their nighttime security arrangements. The horses had made a collective decision to include her in their family structure permanently. As Rachel sat among the sleeping Mustangs under the star-filled Nevada sky, she realized her life had been fundamentally changed. She was no longer just a wildlife photographer documenting animal behavior. She had become part of a wild horse family in ways that science insisted was impossible. 3 days after the python attack, Rachel found herself living a life she never could have imagined. The Mustang herd had not only accepted her as a permanent member, but had begun teaching her the complex social behaviors necessary for survival in their harsh desert environment. Day 4 with the Calico Mountain herd, Rachel recorded into her voice memo, speaking softly to avoid disturbing the horses grazing around her. "They're treating me like a herd member in every way. This goes against everything we know about wild horse behavior." The lead stallion, whom Rachel had named Guardian for his protective nature, had assigned her a specific position within the herd's movement formations. She walked between two experienced mares who guided her pace and alerted her to potential dangers with subtle body language cues. Brave had recovered remarkably well from his python encounter, though he remained close to Rachel whenever possible. The foal had bonded with his human rescuer in ways that created a unique three-way family unit with his biological mother, a mare Rachel called Grace for her elegant movements. "Brave is teaching me as much as his mother is," Rachel observed as the young foal demonstrated how to identify edible plants versus potentially harmful vegetation. "He's showing me which water sources are safe and how to read the warning signs that indicate predators in the area." Dr. Marcus Thompson, a wildlife biologist from the University of Nevada, had tracked down Rachel's location after her magazine reported her missing. His arrival provided an outside perspective on the extraordinary interspecies relationship that had developed. "Rachel, what you've achieved here is scientifically impossible," Dr. Thompson said as he documented the herd's acceptance of Rachel during his visit. "Wild Mustangs don't integrate humans into their social structures, yet these horses are demonstrating every behavioral marker of family acceptance toward you." The most remarkable aspect of Rachel's integration was how the horses had begun modifying their natural behaviors to accommodate her human limitations. They chose routes that were manageable for someone on foot, selected rest stops near clean water sources, and even adjusted their grazing patterns to remain close to areas where Rachel could find suitable shelter. "They're taking care of me," Rachel explained to Dr. Thompson as Grace positioned herself to provide windbreak during a desert storm. "These horses understand that I have different survival needs, and they're adapting their behavior to keep me safe." Guardian's protective instincts toward Rachel had evolved into something that Dr. Thompson described as unprecedented in wild horse research. The stallion would scout ahead for dangers, return to guide Rachel around hazardous terrain, and maintain constant vigilance for threats to his adopted human family member. The communication between Rachel and the herd had developed into a sophisticated system of visual cues, vocal signals, and body language that allowed complex information exchange. Rachel had learned to recognize over 30 different Mustang vocalizations and their meanings. "Watch this," Rachel demonstrated to Dr. Thompson using a specific nickering pattern she had learned from Grace. Brave immediately responded by moving to a protective position, showing that Rachel had successfully communicated a danger warning in the horse's own language. Dr. Thompson's documentation of Rachel's integration would later revolutionize scientific understanding of animal intelligence and social flexibility. The cognitive sophistication required for wild horses to modify their behavior patterns to include a human suggests intelligence levels we've never attributed to equines, he reported. But the most shocking development was yet to come. As word spread about Rachel's unique situation, other Mustang herds in the region began approaching the Calico Mountain group, apparently curious about the human who had become family to wild horses. "Multiple herds are investigating our group," Rachel reported with growing excitement. "It's like they want to understand how cross-species integration is possible. We might be witnessing the beginning of a new relationship between humans and wild Mustangs." As Rachel prepared for sleep surrounded by her adoptive family, she had no idea that the next day would bring an encounter that would shock the entire scientific community and prove that her rescue of Brave had triggered changes in wild horse behavior that would impact generations to come. Dawn broke over the Nevada desert to reveal something that left both Rachel and Dr. Thompson speechless. During the night, 5 additional Mustang herds had approached their location, creating a gathering of nearly 80 wild horses surrounding Rachel's adoptive family, an event that had never been documented in wild Mustang research. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Thompson whispered as he counted the horses through his binoculars. "Wild Mustang herds are territorial. They don't gather in groups this large except during extreme environmental crises." Guardian showed no signs of territorial aggression toward the visiting stallions, which defied fundamental Mustang behavior patterns. Instead, he seemed to be facilitating introductions between Rachel and the other herd leaders, as if presenting her to a council of horse elders. "They're here because of me," Rachel realized as she watched the complex social interactions unfolding around her. Word has somehow spread through the Mustang community about a human who saved a foal and was accepted into a herd. Each visiting stallion approached Rachel individually, conducting what appeared to be formal assessments of her character and behavior. The examinations were thorough but gentle, with the horses testing her responses to various social cues and communication attempts. Brave played a crucial role in these introductions, staying close to Rachel and demonstrating their bond to the visiting horses. His obvious comfort and trust with his human rescuer seemed to validate Rachel's acceptance within the extended Mustang community. "The foals from other herds are particularly interested in Rachel," Dr. Thompson documented as young horses from multiple families gathered around her. "It's as if they understand she's someone who protects their kind." Dr. Sarah Martinez arrived from the National Wild Horse Research Center with a full documentation team, having heard reports of the impossible gathering. Her expertise in Mustang social behavior made her one of the few scientists qualified to interpret what they were witnessing. "This gathering appears to be a form of inter-herd communication about Rachel," Dr. Martinez explained as she observed the horses' behavior patterns. "They're sharing information about her rescue of Brave and her subsequent integration into Guardian's family structure. The most remarkable moment came when an elderly mare from the oldest herd approached Rachel with obvious reverence. The ancient horse, scarred from decades of survival in the harsh desert, extended her muzzle toward Rachel in a gesture that the experts interpreted as deep respect and gratitude. "She's honoring Rachel," Dr. Martinez said with emotion-filled voice. "This old mare represents generations of Mustang wisdom, and she's acknowledging Rachel as the protector of their species." The ceremony that followed would be discussed in scientific circles for years to come. Each herd performed what appeared to be formal presentations to Rachel, with the stallions showcasing their families and the mares bringing their foals forward for her to meet. "They're introducing their children to me," Rachel whispered in amazement as dozens of young horses investigated her with curious but respectful behavior. "These wild horses want me to know their babies." The gathering lasted 3 days, during which Rachel was exposed to communication patterns, social behaviors, and survival techniques from multiple Mustang bloodlines. The horses were essentially providing her with advanced education in wild horse culture. Rachel is receiving knowledge that no human has ever been granted access to, Dr. Thompson reported to the scientific community. These horses are teaching her survival techniques, social protocols, and communication methods that represent generations of accumulated wisdom. The most shocking revelation came when the herds began demonstrating coordinated behaviors around Rachel that suggested they viewed her as a permanent bridge between human and Mustang worlds. They were preparing her for a role that had never existed before. On the final day of the gathering, all 5 visiting herds performed a synchronized departure that left Guardian's family and Rachel as the sole occupants of the valley. But the relationships formed during those 3 days would forever change how wild Mustangs interacted with humans throughout the region. "They've appointed me as some kind of ambassador," Rachel told Dr. Martinez as they watched the last herd disappear over the distant ridge. "These horses have given me a responsibility I never asked for, but can't ignore." 6 months after her life-changing encounter with the python and subsequent adoption by Guardian's herd, Rachel had become something unprecedented in the history of human-wildlife relations, the world's first officially recognized wild Mustang ambassador. Her unique position bridged 2 worlds that had been in conflict for over a century. Rachel's integration with the Calico Mountain herd has revolutionized our approach to wild horse management, announced Dr. Jennifer Walsh, director of the National Wild Horse Association, during a press conference that attracted international media attention. Her insights have prevented 3 planned roundups and led to the establishment of new protection protocols. Rachel split her time between living with Guardian's herd and working with government agencies, ranchers, and conservation groups to develop sustainable solutions for wild horse populations. Her ability to communicate with Mustangs in their own language made her invaluable for resolving human-horse conflicts. When we have disputes over grazing rights or water access, Rachel can literally negotiate with the horses, explained Bureau of Land Management Director Robert Chen. She understands their social structures and can communicate our concerns in ways they comprehend. Brave, now a strong yearling, remained Rachel's constant companion and had become famous as the foal whose rescue triggered a revolution in wild horse relations. His bond with Rachel continued to serve as proof that cross-species relationships could benefit both humans and horses. Guardian's herd had grown to include horses from other families who sought the protection and stability that Rachel's presence provided. Her ability to predict and prevent conflicts with humans made her adoptive family one of the most secure wild horse groups in Nevada. The horses trust Rachel's judgment about human intentions, Dr. Martinez documented in her ongoing research. When she signals that certain people or situations are safe, the entire herd relaxes. When she indicates danger, they immediately move to defensive positions. Rachel's work had attracted support from unexpected sources, including ranchers who had previously viewed wild horses as pests. Her ability to mediate between human and equine needs had created win-win situations that protected both livestock operations and Mustang habitat. Rachel helped us establish grazing rotation schedules that work for both our cattle and the wild horses, said Tom Harrison, a third generation Nevada rancher. Before her intervention, we were heading for a legal battle that would have hurt everyone involved. The most significant achievement came when Rachel successfully prevented the planned roundup of over 200 Mustangs by negotiating a voluntary relocation to better habitat. Her ability to explain the situation to the lead stallions and gain their cooperation saved the horses from the trauma of helicopter captures. She literally asked the horses to move, and they agreed, Dr. Thompson reported in what became known as the Miracle Valley relocation. Rachel explained that their current location was causing conflicts with human activities, and the stallions chose to lead their herds to new territory. International wildlife organizations began consulting Rachel for similar human-animal conflict situations around the world. Her success with wild mustangs provided a model for peaceful coexistence that could be adapted to other species and environments. What Rachel has achieved represents a paradigm shift in conservation philosophy, said Dr. Elena Rodriguez during a United Nations wildlife conference. She's proven that animals are capable of understanding and cooperating with human needs when approached with respect and genuine communication. Rachel's story had inspired a new generation of wildlife professionals who sought to build bridges rather than barriers between human and animal communities. Universities began developing programs in interspecies communication based on her methods, but for Rachel, the most meaningful moments remained the quiet times with Guardian's herd, watching Brave play with younger foals and knowing that her impulsive decision to fight a python had created a legacy of cooperation that would protect wild horses for generations. I never intended to become a wild horse ambassador, Rachel reflected as she sat among her adoptive family under the star-filled Nevada sky. I just couldn't watch a baby die when I had the power to save him. Everything else grew from that moment of choosing compassion over protocol. The Mustangs had taught Rachel that heroism often begins with simple acts of courage, and that the willingness to risk everything for others creates bonds that transcend species and transform entire communities. Rachel's split-second decision to risk her life fighting a python to save a Mustang foal proved that sometimes the most impulsive acts of courage lead to the most profound changes. Her willingness to abandon professional protocol for compassion not only saved Brave's life, but revealed the extraordinary intelligence and emotional capacity of wild horses that science had never fully recognized. The Mustang's shocking response to Rachel's heroism, accepting her as family and eventually appointing her as an ambassador between their world and ours, demonstrates that animals are capable of gratitude, complex social thinking, and cooperative relationships that can benefit entire ecosystems when approached with respect and understanding. Today, Rachel continues her work as the world's first wild Mustang ambassador, using the trust and communication skills gained from her adoptive herd to protect thousands of horses across the American West. Her story has inspired new approaches to wildlife conservation that prioritize cooperation over conflict and prove that building bridges between species creates solutions that benefit everyone involved. If this story inspired you, subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of courage and the shocking ways animals respond to human compassion. Leave a like if Rachel's bravery and the Mustang's gratitude touched your heart, and share this story with someone who needs to remember that heroes come in all forms and that sometimes the greatest changes begin with simple acts of courage. What would you risk to save an innocent life? Let us know in the comments, and remember, the bonds we forge through compassion can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities and species.
A German shepherd stood motionless in the pouring rain, his fur soaked, ribs showing, eyes locked on an old black truck hidden behind rows of shipping containers. No one saw him arrive. No one knew what he had come for. But inside that truck, bound and barely breathing, a U.S. Marine was losing his last bit of hope. Moments later, a Doberman emerged beside him, scarred but swift, and a limping Rottweiler followed close behind. They had no masters, no names, no promise of safety, but they remembered the scent of mercy, because once someone had shown it to them. What happened next will break your heart and heal it all at once. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no soul should be left forgotten in the dark, hit that subscribe button, because this story, this one, is a miracle wrapped in mud and loyalty. Bay Ridge, a coastal city in southern Oregon, bore the kind of autumn that left a sting. Cold rain fell in curtains, blanketing the harbor in a veil of mist. Ships swayed gently in the gray-blue water, their ropes creaking against rusted cleats. The streets, slick with oil and rainwater, reflected the trembling lights of weathered lampposts. It was the kind of day when even seagulls sought cover. In an alley between a shuttered fish market and a graffiti-stained brick wall, 3 stray dogs padded quietly through puddles, their breath fogging the air with each exhale. Rex, a 6-year-old sable-coated German shepherd, walked ahead of the group with the natural poise of a leader. His ears were perpetually erect, eyes scanning every movement, every shifting shadow. His left foreleg bore a faint scar, remnants of a life before the streets. Once trained as a search and rescue K9, he'd been retired and eventually abandoned after his handler's deployment turned permanent. Rex no longer trusted humans, but he had not forgotten how to protect. His gait was smooth, deliberate, and his tail swayed like a metronome of caution. Close behind him trotted Duke, a 4-year-old Doberman with a glossy black and rust coat and lean frame. He was quick-footed and quicker-tempered, a bundle of nervous energy that rarely stayed still. Duke had once belonged to a woman who bred show dogs, but his imperfect gait from a minor birth defect had him discarded like damaged goods. Now, his eyes burned with suspicion, and his body twitched at every car horn or loud crash. But in Rex, he had found calmness. He followed him like a shadow, impatient, alert, but loyal. Trailing them, slightly slower, was Brutus, a broad-shouldered Rottweiler approaching his 7th year. His face, framed by a thick black and mahogany ruff, bore the weary softness of a creature too gentle for the world he'd fallen into. His right hind leg limped slightly from an old wound, possibly from a trap, possibly from a fight. Brutus never spoke first, never initiated conflict, but he would throw himself between his companions and danger without hesitation. Strangers often mistook his size for aggression, but his bark was rare and always a warning, never a threat. The 3 had become a unit not out of convenience, but out of quiet necessity. Over weeks of shared scraps, narrow escapes, and cold nights huddled under bridges, they had formed a bond. Together, they were a pack, nameless to most, but everything to each other. This evening, as the sky cracked with thunder and the air smelled of rust and salt, the pack found themselves wandering through a fenced-off section of the harbor. The main street was too noisy, too exposed. Rex led them along the edge of an abandoned loading yard filled with shipping containers, stacked like forgotten relics. There, partially hidden behind a wall of sea-green crates, sat a matte black delivery van. It was the only vehicle in the lot, its windshield fogged over and wipers paused mid-swipe. Rex stopped cold, nose lifted. Rain ran down his fur in rivulets, but his focus narrowed. He turned toward the van and sniffed again. His hackles rose slightly. The scent was faint but undeniable. Blood, metal, and something else. Old rope. He took a slow step forward. Duke followed closely. Tense. "Something's off," his eyes seemed to say as he flicked his ears toward Rex, who lowered his head and crept closer to the van's driver's side door. Brutus remained still behind them, watching the perimeter, his chest rising and falling in deep, even breaths. The dogs approached the vehicle cautiously. Rex circled toward the passenger side, nose pressed low to the ground. Duke, more impulsive, leaped onto a crate near the front tire and peered into the driver's window, his paws thumping against the wet metal. Inside, he saw a man. Ethan Cole, a 32-year-old Marine corporal, sat slumped over the steering wheel. His short, sandy blonde hair was matted with sweat, and a faint cut bled near his temple. Duct tape sealed his mouth, his wrists bound tightly with rope around the steering column. His eyes, clouded with exhaustion and fear, fluttered open for a second. For a moment, he met Duke's gaze. Duke growled low in his throat, not out of anger, but urgency. Ethan had been ambushed less than an hour earlier. While walking toward his truck from a nearby military storage yard, he'd caught sight of a suspicious exchange between two dock workers and a stranger in a dark coat. Before he could speak, something heavy struck the back of his head. Now, trapped and left in the van with the engine running, he was slowly slipping into unconsciousness. Duke barked sharply, once. Brutus stepped forward, concern in his eyes. Rex, now beside the rear door, placed both paws on the side panel and let out a short, commanding growl. No humans responded. The rain muffled everything. The warehouse beyond them stood silent. Rex dropped to the ground and sniffed along the wheel well. The scent was stronger here. He could smell the blood on Ethan's knuckles and the faint oil of the ropes. This was no sleeping man. This was a prisoner. The dogs exchanged glances. Duke ran toward a pile of debris near the edge of the yard. Old tools, rotting pallets, broken fencing. He dug frantically, paws scraping against metal and gravel until he pulled free a rusted iron crowbar about half his body's length. Clamping his teeth around the center, he dragged it awkwardly across the yard, tail high with adrenaline. Brutus met him halfway and carefully bit the opposite end, both walking it toward the van like trained search dogs delivering equipment. Rex barked once, an unspoken signal. Together, the two dogs lifted the crowbar to the narrow gap between the driver's side mirror and window frame. Duke held steady, angling the tip into the crease while Brutus pushed with his bulk. The metal screeched against the frame. Rain poured over their heads. Brutus adjusted his stance and pushed again, his full weight bearing down. A sudden crack rang out. The mirror popped, the window flexed. Then, a thud. The window fractured, not shattering entirely, but creating a fault line in the glass. Rex climbed up, pressed his snout against the cracked section, and with a guttural growl, bit down at the tape-sealed edge. He yanked. A piece of glass fell inward with a clatter. Enough. Ethan's eyes widened in disbelief. Water dripped from Rex's muzzle as he nosed his way in, teeth carefully tugging at the rope around the Marine's arm. It was too tight. Duke joined in, using his body to hold the steering wheel while Rex worked the knot. Brutus stood guard outside, ears flattened, watching the perimeter of the yard. His eyes scanned the street. No sign of the captors yet, but the rain had a way of hiding more than just the cold. Inside the van, Rex gave a final pull, and the knot slipped. Ethan's arm dropped, weak but free. The Marine groaned beneath the tape, his body slumping sideways as exhaustion overtook adrenaline. Outside, Duke barked again, sharp and urgent. The storm had not passed, but something had begun. The rain had not let up. It tapped rhythmically on the roof of the black van, masking the labored breaths of the man inside and the quiet, coordinated movements of the dogs outside. Steam hissed from the van's exhaust pipe, coiling upward into the haze before vanishing like a ghost. The engine still purred and idle, its steady vibration the only sign that the vehicle, and its captive, had not been abandoned entirely. Rex paced in tight arcs beside the van, nose skimming along the seams of the doors, while Brutus remained near the rear bumper, watching the street beyond with quiet intensity. His deep-set eyes blinked slowly, scanning for motion, for sound, anything out of place. Inside the van, Ethan Cole stirred. The rope had left deep grooves in his wrists, and blood crusted near the edges of the duct tape across his mouth. His breathing was shallow, a mix of pain, exhaustion, and the unbearable stuffiness of the cabin air. His legs were still tied at the ankles, arms only half free after the dog's effort. He slumped sideways across the seat, eyes fluttering open once more. Every muscle in his body screamed for stillness, but instinct pushed him to move. It was the scent that hit him first. Not the familiar musk of dog fur wet with rain, but the sickly tang of gasoline mingled with cheap air freshener and warm leather. The cab reeked of artificial citrus, the kind they sprayed in used cars, but underneath that, something raw. Sweat, old blood, and engine fumes. Ethan tried to adjust his position, but his side struck the gear shifter, jostling him painfully. His head throbbed where it had been struck. A flash of memory returned, sudden and sharp. He'd been walking along Pier 19, returning from a supply run, at the military depot on the far side of the harbor. The sun had been low then, casting the bay in a golden hue. He remembered checking his phone, replying to a message from Corporal Downey, and then darkness. Just before everything went black, he'd seen a white van pull into the alley without headlights. A figure stepped out. Tall, leather gloves, the swing of a metal pipe, then nothing. Now, hours later, he was here, bound, aching, and utterly disoriented. Outside the van, Duke stood motionless. His body trembled, not from cold, but from the sensation crawling along his spine. Something about the air was wrong. The scent trail led behind the van, toward the back wall of the lot, where a narrow alley opened between two warehouses. He lowered his nose, sniffed the pavement, then looked sharply toward the shadows. Without waiting, he darted off, disappearing into the alley with a determined stride. The alley reeked of mildew and rain-soaked cardboard. Garbage bins lined one wall, and a stack of broken pallets leaned against a rusted fence that separated the lot from a condemned construction site. The site itself had once been intended for waterfront condominiums. At least that's what the faded blueprints posted on the gate suggested. But the project had been stalled for months after the developer went bankrupt. Now, it was a graveyard of half-poured foundations and forgotten scaffolding. Near the gate, Duke caught sight of it, a twisted length of metal poking out from beneath a tarp. He sniffed once, then lunged, biting down at the center of the object. It was a crowbar, old and red with rust, its edges dulled with age but still solid. He tugged it free, the tarp collapsing behind him, then began the awkward trek back toward the van. Rain pelted his back. He didn't stop. Back at the van, Rex had begun pawing at the base of the doorframe while Brutus stood alert beside the wheel well. When Duke returned, dragging the crowbar between his jaws, both dogs turned toward him. The gesture required no translation. The plan had formed, unspoken, instinctual. The three dogs gathered near the driver's side. Duke dropped the bar at Rex's feet, tail stiff with urgency. Brutus sniffed the tool once, then carefully picked it up at the thick end. He turned his body sideways, bracing his front paws near the door hinge. Rex approached, positioning the curved tip of the bar into the narrow groove between door and frame. Rain dripped from his snout. He held it steady as Brutus adjusted the angle with his teeth. Then, with a grunt-like snarl, Brutus leaned forward, pressing his weight into the bar. The metal groaned but did not budge. They tried again. This time, Duke planted his forepaws on the door just above Rex's head, applying pressure downward as Brutus pushed. The rain soaked their fur, turning their coats into dark sheets of wet velvet. The smell of metal, rust, and rubber filled the air. Then, crack. The door shifted slightly, just enough. Rex seized the gap, wedged his snout inside, and barked, short and sharp. Inside, Ethan jerked up at the sound. He saw a sliver of movement, the glint of dog eyes through the space. With what strength remained, he reached forward, straining against the rope on his legs, and pressed his shoulder into the side panel. A pop. The door clicked open. Ethan collapsed sideways into the rain, hitting the pavement with a splash. He gasped, the duct tape still on his mouth, the world spinning around him. The cold helped. The rain shocked him back into focus. Rex was at his side instantly, nosing the tape. Brutus hovered behind, shielding Ethan with his bulk from the open lot. Duke paced in tight circles, ears twitching at every echo. Ethan lifted a trembling hand and ripped at the tape, his fingers slippery but determined. When it finally came free, he sucked in a full breath of the salt-thick air. He stared at the three dogs surrounding him, disbelief etched into his bruised face. Before he could speak, Rex stepped forward, nudged his arm, then turned to look over his shoulder, toward the alley. The rain paused for half a heartbeat. A footstep sounded. Someone was coming. The rain pounded harder now, as if the sky had chosen that very moment to unleash its full weight on the quiet, forgotten corner of Bay Ridge's dockyard. Puddles deepened into slick pools of grime and runoff, reflecting the red taillights of the black van where Ethan Cole lay barely conscious. Every breath he drew was laced with gasoline fumes and the damp chill of oncoming shock. Just outside, the three dogs stood in formation, silent, focused, unflinching. Duke moved first. His jaws still clenched around the rusted crowbar he had retrieved. He approached the side window of the van like a soldier approaching an objective. The Doberman's muscles, lean and taut from weeks of surviving on the street, rippled beneath his soaked black and tan coat. He had once belonged to a wealthy family on the North Ridge, a showpiece pet in a glass house. That ended the day the youngest son got a Staffordshire puppy, and Duke was quietly rehomed through a friend of a friend. He never saw a warm bed again. But what he lost in comfort, he gained in grit. He dropped the crowbar at Rex's feet with a clink, shaking the water from his ears. Rex, ever the tactician, sniffed the tool, then looked to Brutus. A silent nod passed between them. Brutus, larger, heavier, more deliberate, stepped forward. 7 years old, he had a broad chest and thick, slightly curled fur around his neck. There was a calmness to him, a slow patience that belied his intimidating size. Brutus had been rescued once by an elderly man named Lionel, who ran a salvage yard on the east side. After Lionel died alone in his kitchen, Brutus had waited 3 days beside the body before someone found him. Since then, he never got close to another human, but dogs he understood. Rex, the eldest of the trio, positioned himself facing the mouth of the alley, ears pointed like antennae, tail still. The German shepherd stood watch, unmoving save for the slight twitch of his hind leg with each fresh bolt of thunder. His duty was clear: guard the perimeter while the others worked. Duke nudged the crowbar toward the frame of the passenger side window. Brutus stepped in, picked up the thicker end in his powerful jaws, and positioned the narrow curve into the thin space between the window and the door's edge. It wasn't easy. His grip slipped on the wet metal, and he had to readjust twice, turning his head sideways to apply pressure in the right angle. The crowbar squealed as it bit into the gap. The sound was sharp, scraping, and unnatural against the rain's rhythm. Inside the van, Ethan heard it. His eyes, half-lidded moments ago, opened wider. The sound of iron on metal was like a scream in the fog, but it was real. It was hope. Brutus pressed his body forward, planting his front paws against the van's frame. Duke jumped up beside him, placing his paws on the glass above the crowbar, adding his weight to keep the tool steady. Brutus pushed, shifted, then gave a low, throaty grunt as he leaned harder. The window groaned. Then came a thin crack, the first fracture. A small vein of shattered glass ran across the lower edge, spidering outward. Brutus paused, then bit down again with renewed force. The crack widened. The metal groaned louder. Thunder rolled above them, echoing through the empty loading yard like a distant drum roll. Just then, movement flickered at the edge of the lot. A figure darted between two containers, a man in a dark hoodie, face obscured, boots sloshing through puddles. Rex growled low and sharp. His body shifted to intercept. He didn't lunge, not yet, but he made his presence known. The figure froze briefly, then backed away into the shadows. Brutus grunted again, pushing the crowbar with his full chest now, Duke still adding weight from above. The crack suddenly gave way with a wet pop. The glass splintered and dropped inward in a half sheet, clattering across the floor mats of the van's passenger side. Rex moved. In a flash, he leapt to the door, wedged his muzzle through the broken space, and grabbed the remaining rope around Ethan's right wrist. His teeth bit precisely, tugging, pulling, not with brute force, but with calculated pressure, like a trained working dog. The knot slipped, loosened. Rex bit again, this time closer to the wrist. Ethan grunted as blood rushed back into his hand, pins and needles igniting every nerve. Brutus dropped the crowbar and used his massive front leg to hook the door handle from the outside. It shifted slightly. A push. Another push. The door creaked open an inch. That was all Duke needed. He jumped up and threw his body into the seam, sliding the panel wide enough for Ethan to fall. And fall he did. The Marine collapsed onto the wet asphalt, landing on his side, his head striking the cold ground with a thud. He gasped, rainwater hitting his face and mixing with blood. His arms flailed weakly, but the cold air was a balm. The dogs surrounded him, their breath visible in the fog, tails still, eyes searching. Ethan rolled onto his back, staring up at the sky. "Am I dead?" he croaked, voice hoarse, eyes wide. Rex nudged his shoulder. Duke licked his cheek, and Brutus stood beside his legs, forming a protective arc. "No, not dead," Ethan murmured, barely believing it himself. From behind the shipping containers, another set of footsteps began to echo. He wasn't out of danger yet. Ethan staggered to his feet, his limbs shaking under the weight of cold rain and adrenaline. The pavement beneath him felt uneven, slick with water and oil, and his legs refused to cooperate without protest. His mind still reeled from the captivity. The van, the ropes, the suffocating silence, and now there was no time to breathe. Behind the rows of rusting containers, footsteps pounded. A sharp voice echoed through the narrow dockyard. "They're over here!" Another voice, lower, rougher, followed. "Get the dog first!" Rex didn't wait. With a clipped bark, he turned sharply and trotted toward a narrow break between two stacks of cargo bins. His gait was purposeful, calculated, as if he had memorized the terrain. Ethan limped behind, his soaked boots slipping on the concrete, one hand clutching his side. Duke flanked his left, body lowered in a prowler's crouch, ears swiveling for sound. Brutus followed behind, glancing back toward the van with a low growl rising in his chest. They moved fast across the lot, rounding a collapsed chain-link fence where the shipping yard ended and the old market district began. The transition was abrupt, from industrial decay to the dim-lit chaos of narrow lanes and tarpaulin-covered stalls. The Bay Ridge night market had long been a patchwork of cultures, smells, and shadows. Once a popular evening spot for local vendors and tourists alike, the market had decayed with the port's decline. Now, only a few stubborn vendors remained, cooking fish on charcoal grills and selling tarnished trinkets under flickering bulbs. A canopy of patched blue tarp stretched overhead, collecting rain in sagging pockets. Ethan ducked as he entered the first corridor, greeted by the acrid scent of grilled mackerel mixed with rotting vegetables. His breath came in shallow bursts, and his bruised ribs ached with each step. The dogs weaved ahead and beside him, Duke brushing his leg protectively, Brutus pausing to let him catch up, Rex constantly glancing back as if recalculating their route. They passed an elderly woman tending to a soup pot under a green awning. Her name was Mrs. Leon, a Vietnamese widow in her 70s who had sold pho in the same stall since her husband's death 20 years ago. Petite and hunched from arthritis, she wore a clear plastic poncho and a faded pink scarf. Her expression remained unreadable as she watched Ethan and the dogs rush past. She did not speak, nor did she raise the ladle from her pot. The next stall was manned by a heavy-set man in a tank top, arms covered in faded sailor tattoos. Ramon Vega, a former Navy cook turned street vendor, grilled skewers under a rusting corrugated roof. His brow furrowed when he saw Ethan, but he said nothing. In Bay Ridge's night market, you minded your own. Behind them, the shouts returned. "There! In the alley!" The dogs increased pace. Rex turned left into a narrower lane, one that sloped downward toward the riverbank. Ethan slipped, but caught himself against a pole wrapped in wire and garlic strings. Brutus gave a supportive bump with his shoulder, steadying him. Rain leaked through every gap in the patchwork ceiling. Tarps sagged and snapped in the wind. A bulb sparked, then died. From somewhere deeper in the market came the hiss of gas escaping from a poorly maintained stove. A sudden screech of boots on wet pavement. A figure emerged at the end of the lane, tall, cloaked in a dark raincoat, holding a wooden bat. He stepped into their path, face pale under the glow of a hanging light. His eyes were narrow, calculating, his grip on the bat tight. He was younger than Ethan, probably in his 20s, with a wiry build and twitchy shoulders. The type who followed orders without understanding them. His name was Wyatt, but no one in the group would learn that tonight. He raised the bat, took a step forward, and hissed, "You're not going anywhere." Brutus growled, low and thunderous. Ethan tried to speak, but Rex had already moved. The shepherd bolted forward, barking once, a sharp, commanding sound, and veered right, drawing the man's attention. It worked. The bat shifted. That was Duke's cue. The Doberman shot forward like a slingshot released. He clamped onto the hem of the man's pants, yanking backward with vicious force. The man lost his footing on the wet stone and stumbled. Brutus, not missing his chance, charged and rammed the man square in the chest with his shoulder. The bat flew sideways, clattering against a steel drum. The man collapsed with a grunt, breath knocked from his lungs, and did not rise. "Move!" Ethan gasped, pushing past the scene with Duke and Brutus quickly joining his sides again. Rex gave one final bark near the fallen man, then pivoted and resumed the lead. They ran. Past the final row of stalls, past the flickering red neon of Lowe's Fresh Fish, where a tabby cat blinked from behind stacked crates, past a boarded-up fruit stand, and finally through a sagging archway that opened into the floodplain behind the river's industrial channel. There, between the tree line and the cement foundation of an old boathouse, lay a narrow metal footbridge. It was slick, barely lit and rusted in patches. But beyond it, across the channel, was a collection of warehouses no longer used, forgotten by the city but dry and quiet. Rex paused at the bridge's mouth, scanning. Ethan bent over, hands on his knees, struggling for breath. His body screamed to stop, to rest. But the dogs did not. Duke paced the entrance of the bridge nervously, ears back. Brutus stood at Ethan's side, his tail high and still. Then Rex barked once, a sharp note of decision. They crossed the bridge into the dark. The rain had slowed to a mist by the time Ethan and the dogs reached the warehouse. The footbridge behind them creaked one last time under Brutus's weight, and then silence. The warehouse stood hunched on the riverbank like an old beast, forgotten by time. Its corrugated walls were rusted through in places, and several windows were broken, leaving jagged teeth of glass at the edges. Above the door hung a faded sign, barely legible, Mason Shipping Co. Est, 1942. Ivy had begun reclaiming the southern side of the structure, creeping up the walls like green veins on a dying husk. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and sawdust. The floorboards groaned under their weight as they moved through the gloom. Ethan limped toward a stack of wooden crates near the center and collapsed against one, breath ragged and shallow. The cold still clung to his soaked clothes, but at least here, under a roof, the wind couldn't reach him. The dogs followed without hesitation. Brutus took a position beside Ethan's right, planting his large frame protectively close. Duke curled near Ethan's feet, still alert, while Rex stood watch at the cracked door, eyes glinting in the dimness. Ethan groaned as he fumbled with the last loop of cord around his wrists. The rope had bitten deep into the skin, leaving red welts and broken flesh. His fingers, numb and trembling, refused to obey. He grit his teeth, trying again, hissing in pain. That's when he felt a warm breath against his hand. Rex had returned, crouching close. The German shepherd extended a paw, not to touch, but to be near, as if to say, "You're not alone." The gesture steadied him. After a few more clumsy attempts, the rope slipped free and fell to the ground with a damp thud. Ethan flexed his wrists slowly, trying to ignore the sting. He looked down at the three dogs now gathered around him. Only now, in the relative stillness, did he begin to see them, not just as saviors, but as creatures marked by hardship. Rex, the German shepherd, stood tall even while resting. His sable coat was once likely pristine, but now streaked with dirt and damp. One of his ears was cleanly torn, an old injury, healed poorly, the kind earned in a fight for dominance or survival. His posture was calm, but his amber eyes never stopped scanning the shadows. There was intelligence there, and responsibility. He moved like a dog who'd once known structure but had long since relied on instinct. Duke, the Doberman, was lean to the point of gauntness. His ribs pressed sharply against his skin, and his gait carried a slight imbalance, suggesting a recent injury that hadn't healed right. Still, there was fire in his dark eyes and a restlessness to his movements. He was the first to respond to every sound, every creak. His short coat clung tightly to his frame, highlighting both his strength and the toll street life had taken. Brutus, the Rottweiler, was a mass of muscle and scars. His right rear leg carried a noticeable limp, likely from an untreated break. Yet, despite his bulk, he was the most tender with Ethan, his head often resting near Ethan's hip, eyes lifted with concern. His jowls sagged just enough to give him a permanent expression of somber curiosity. Brutus wasn't fast, but he was solid, a protector. Ethan took a slow breath, leaning back against the crate. The dogs had clearly formed a pack, a unit as tight-knit as any military squad. They moved as one, relied on each other, and now had included him. He didn't know why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe something in his scent reminded them of someone they'd once trusted. Or maybe, just maybe, these dogs were more than abandoned strays. They were survivors, like him. He glanced around the warehouse. There were no windows on the north side, only stacked crates and old tarps. The roof leaked slightly where a vent had rusted through, dripping onto a forgotten coil of rope. Beyond that was a ladder leading up to a catwalk, unstable but useful should they need to gain elevation or hide higher up. For a moment, all was still. Then a distant engine rumbled. Rex's ears pricked. Ethan tensed. The sound grew louder, closer, until headlights swept across the warehouse's high-set windows. The glass caught the beams, flaring white for a split second. An engine idled. Then, the low scrape of tires over gravel. A vehicle had stopped just outside. Brutus growled softly, rising to his feet. Duke's head turned sharply toward the main doors, hackles up. Rex remained by the side door, body frozen but alert, eyes watching the seams of light at the frame. Ethan's pulse quickened. He mouthed a curse and struggled to his feet. His boots squelched as he stood. He moved toward the dogs, whispering, "We have to move. Now." A beam of light pierced the warehouse from a flashlight cutting through the cracks. Heavy boots crunched outside on the gravel. Voices murmured. One was a woman's, sharp, commanding. "Check the back entrance. They couldn't have gotten far." Ethan gestured toward the side of the warehouse where the crates were piled higher. A space between the stacks led to a broken portion of the wall, just wide enough for the dogs to squeeze through. Beyond it was a gully filled with overgrown weeds and discarded pallets. A mess of a path, but a path nonetheless. The dogs understood. Duke moved first, nosing at the gap and slipping through. Brutus followed, slower, his injured leg making it more difficult. Rex waited for Ethan, guiding him toward the exit with a light nudge of the shoulder. Ethan ducked through the breach just as the warehouse's main door creaked open. A man stepped in, broad-shouldered, flashlight raised. He swept the beam across the floor, catching the scattered rope and damp footprints. "Over here!" he called. Ethan and the dogs crawled through the weeds and into the darkness beyond, hearts pounding. The storm had not let up. Rain thudded on corrugated steel, dripping from the rusted eaves of the long-abandoned warehouse. Outside, the wind howled against the line of containers stacked 3 high along the old shipping yard, their faded paint streaked with salt and grime. Ethan Cole crouched low, his breath misting in the cold air. Every muscle in his body braced for the next move. Behind him, the 3 dogs moved like shadows, silent, sharp, alert. Rex, the sable-coated German shepherd with intelligent amber eyes, took point. His ears twitched at every sound, his body low and poised, like a soldier returning to a battlefield he'd never left. Duke, the sleek black Doberman, was close behind, his frame thin but taut with energy, while Brutus, the scarred Rottweiler, limped but kept pace, his massive shoulders hunched protectively near Ethan's legs. The dockside reeked of fish oil, rust, and something more acrid, burnt rubber maybe, or the scent of something mechanical left too long in the rain. The waterfront of West Ham, a decaying port town in southern Louisiana, had long since fallen into disuse. The cranes that once moved cargo now stood still, their arms creaking like dying trees in the wind. It was the perfect place for people to disappear, or hide. Ethan led them toward the loading ramp that descended into the lower dockside bays. The storm and the pounding surf cloaked their movement. He kept one hand pressed against the metal siding for balance, the other clenched instinctively, still trembling from the adrenaline of escape. His torn shirt clung to his ribs. The old bandage around his midsection soaked through, blood mixing with rain. Suddenly Rex halted, ears up, nose twitching. A moment later the faint crunch of gravel. Human footsteps. Ethan froze. He pressed his back against a shipping container, motioning silently to the dogs. Duke's lips curled, silent growl vibrating in his chest, while Brutus positioned himself in front of Ethan like a living barricade. Around the corner came 2 men. One was tall, bald, with a jagged scar trailing down the side of his face, wearing a rain-drenched camo jacket. The other, wiry with jittery eyes, carried a flashlight and a baton in his right hand. Their boots splashed through puddles, steps heavy, careless. "There's nowhere he could have gone," Scar muttered. "He's bleeding and limping." "Yeah, but they said he's got dogs with him. Big ones." Scar scoffed. "Dogs don't matter. Shoot one, the rest run." Duke didn't wait for the insult to go unpunished. With a snarl like tearing fabric, he launched from behind the container, a blur of black fury. His jaws closed on Scar's wrist, spinning the man sideways. The baton dropped with a clatter. The second man raised his weapon, but Brutus barreled forward, shoulder-checking him with terrifying force. The wiry thug flew backward into the puddles, head smacking the edge of the dock railing. "Rex, go!" Ethan barked, already limping toward the next alley of containers. Rex moved instantly, his body pressing against Ethan's legs, guiding him around crates and coiled ropes. Behind them, Brutus growled over the downed man, ensuring he wouldn't rise soon, while Duke gave one last tug at Scar's arm before releasing and retreating, eyes glowing with cold fury. They darted past a row of rusting forklifts, wheels half submerged in oily rainwater, then slid beneath the slats of an old loading ramp. The underside of the pier was dark and slick, smelling of algae and rot. Ethan fell hard onto the wooden planks, his breath catching. Rex nudged his side, steadying him. Brutus and Duke crawled under, barely fitting, their chests heaving, bodies slick and trembling from cold and tension. Ethan took a moment to listen. The pounding footsteps faded into the distance. Then, nothing but the drum of rain and the distant churn of waves against the wharf. He leaned his head back, pressed it to the damp wood, and exhaled shakily. They weren't safe yet, but they had space. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Then footsteps again. Different ones. Lighter, more measured. Ethan tensed. Through a crack in the floorboards, a beam of flashlight swept by. He held his breath. A girl's voice called out, muffled but urgent. "I think they went this way. Look, blood on the railing." Ethan's brow furrowed. A girl? Above them, two more figures came into view. One was a teenage girl in a drenched yellow raincoat, dark braids clinging to her cheeks. Her expression was alert, not cruel. Beside her was a lean man in his 50s, salt and pepper beard, holding a lantern instead of a gun. "They're not with the others," Ethan whispered to himself. The girl's name was Eliza Tron, a 17-year-old local who had grown up near the docks. Tall for her age, with an angular face and clever gray eyes, she was known for helping stray animals and for chasing rumors of missing pets in the alleys of West Ham. Her family owned a rundown bait shop nearby. After hearing barking earlier, she had followed the sounds, fearing someone had hurt another dog. She didn't expect to find a bleeding Marine. She paused at the edge of the dock. "Hey, I know someone's under there. I won't call the cops. I swear." The man beside her, Mr. Rourke, was her uncle, broad-shouldered, kind-eyed, a veteran harbor mechanic who had once served with the Coast Guard. "We saw those men chasing you," he called softly. "You're not safe out here." Rex growled low, protective, but Ethan gently laid a hand on his neck. "They don't mean harm." Cautiously, Ethan pushed himself up. His voice cracked. "I need help." Brutus shifted aside as Ethan crawled out from beneath the dock. Rain poured down his face, his shirt clinging like a second skin. The lantern's glow lit up his features, bruised, bloodied, but unmistakably a soldier. "Oh my God," Eliza whispered. "You're hurt." Then her eyes dropped to the dogs, who emerged one by one, muddy, silent, like sentinels. She didn't flinch. She crouched, extending her hand. "Hey there, big guy," she murmured to Brutus. "You protected him, didn't you?" Brutus sniffed her fingers, then leaned his heavy head into her palm. Mr. Rourke knelt beside Ethan. "There's an old storm shelter behind the shop. Dry, safe, not much, but better than this." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Together, with dogs flanking them and rain easing to a drizzle, they vanished into the shadows of West Ham's forgotten alleys. The storm had softened to a drizzle by the time Eliza led the way through a narrow alley behind her uncle's bait shop. A rusted metal gate groaned as she pushed it open, revealing a low, concrete structure nestled between the warehouse wall and a row of stacked lobster traps. The shelter was once a storm cellar for dock workers, a space no bigger than a small garage, but tonight it would be sanctuary. Inside, it smelled faintly of salt, old netting, and the damp of concrete that hadn't dried in years. There was a cot in the corner covered with a patched wool blanket, a metal cabinet filled with canned food and supplies, and a yellowed bulb overhead flickering with tired electricity. Eliza handed Ethan a dry towel and a faded navy sweatshirt 2 sizes too big. "We keep this stuff for the guys who don't have anywhere to go during hurricane season," she explained with a shrug, wiping rain from her forehead. "It's not much, but you'll be safe." Ethan gave a faint smile, pain etched into the creases around his eyes. "It's more than enough. Thank you." As Eliza and her uncle disappeared back through the gate with a promise to return in the morning, Ethan shut the door and slid the heavy latch. He turned to the dogs. Brutus was already curled on the cot like a protective mountain of muscle, his broad head resting across the edge. Duke, ever vigilant, paced the perimeter of the room once before settling near the door, his paws muddy but controlled. Rex stood in the center, watching Ethan with those fierce eyes that never seemed to blink. Ethan knelt, wincing as his joints protested. He reached for the water basin and soaked a cloth, then carefully wiped the dirt from Rex's paws. "You boys saved my life," he said softly. "Now let me take care of you for once." He repeated the process with Brutus, lifting the Rottweiler's injured leg gently, inspecting the swelling. The old wound didn't seem infected, just poorly healed. Ethan wrapped it with clean gauze from the first aid kit on the wall. When he reached Duke, the Doberman flinched for the first time. His ribs were visible under the short black coat, every breath shallow. "You've been starving," Ethan murmured. He pulled out a few cans of beef stew, opened them with a shaky hand, and set the bowls on the floor. The dogs hesitated. Then Rex stepped forward and took the first bite. The others followed. Ethan slumped against the wall, watching them eat in silence. The hum of distant waves pressed in through the concrete walls. Outside, the city of West Ham slept uneasily. For the first time in what felt like days, Ethan allowed himself to breathe. His body ached in 1,000 places. The bruises would bloom darker by morning. The cut on his temple throbbed with dull rhythm. But the warmth inside the shelter, the steady sound of jaws chewing, and the faint golden glow of the overhead light calmed him more than morphine ever could. After the dogs had eaten their fill, they slowly circled the room, sniffing corners, inspecting the mattress, the cabinet, even the drain. Then, as if by silent agreement, they lay close together near the cot. Rex positioned himself facing the door. Brutus curled tighter, snoring gently. Duke remained half alert, ears twitching even as his eyes closed. Ethan sat on the edge of the cot, unable to sleep. He reached into the inside pocket of his torn cargo pants and pulled out a small photograph. Creased, water-damaged, but still visible. It showed a group of Marines, arms over shoulders, grinning into a sunset. He stared at it for a long time before folding it back into place. A sudden bark shattered the silence. Rex had snapped awake, standing stiffly, his head turned toward the door. Duke followed a second later, growling low. Brutus lumbered up last, still limping, but his posture alert. Ethan was on his feet instantly. He pressed his back against the concrete wall and reached for the wrench he'd laid beside the cot earlier. His heart thudded in his chest. Then, another sound, a faint scrape, metal on concrete. He inched to the small slit window above the door, just barely wide enough to see a sliver of the outside world. In the dim light cast by a nearby street lamp, he caught movement. A figure in a dark hooded jacket. Male, maybe late 30s, average build. His posture was hunched, cautious, and his right hand held something. A crowbar. The man stepped closer to the shelter door and tested the latch. When it didn't budge, he leaned in, pressing his ear to the cold surface. Rex exploded into a fierce bark. A split second later, Brutus joined in, his deep growl shaking the floor. Duke let out a vicious snarl, lunging toward the door with claws scraping. The man jerked back in shock. His face became momentarily visible in the window's light. Narrow, pale, with dark bags under his eyes. Ethan recognized him. One of the men from the ambush on the convoy. A scout or low-tier thug, the kind used to clean up after messier work. Ethan gripped the wrench tighter, but didn't move. He watched. Outside, the man cursed under his breath and stumbled backward. The snarling and barking grew louder, feral and unrelenting. The sound of 3 dogs determined to tear through steel if needed. The man bolted. Ethan waited until the footsteps faded. Then he exhaled, slowly. He turned to the dogs. They had returned to their positions, though Duke's tail still flicked with agitation. "You're not just survivors," Ethan said. "You're guardians." He knelt and placed a hand on Rex's head. "You didn't just save me. You're still saving me." Outside, the wind shifted. The sea sang its distant hymn. Inside, for the first time, Ethan felt not like a fugitive, but like a man with brothers in fur and fang. The days that followed the encounter at the shelter unfolded in quiet resolution. The storm passed. The city of West Ham, ever familiar with chaos, hummed back into routine, unaware that a man and 3 dogs had rewritten each other's fate in the shadows of the docks. Ethan rose early that morning with one purpose: to make it official. He stood at the front desk of the Bay Ridge Animal Control Office, its white stucco walls stained with decades of sun and salt. The woman behind the counter was in her mid-50s, with a halo of silver curls and glasses that hung from a beaded chain around her neck. Her name was Deborah, as stitched on her faded green vest, and she had the cautious kindness of someone who'd seen both the worst and best of people. "You're the Marine that called about the 3 strays, right?" she asked, flipping through a clipboard. Ethan nodded. "They're not strays anymore." He filled out the paperwork slowly, signing each dog into his name. Deborah raised a brow when she read the names he'd written: Rex Valor, Brutus Storm, and Duke Ember. "Those are serious names," she remarked with a smile. "They're serious dogs," Ethan replied, then softened. "They saved my life. I owe them everything." After the forms were signed and fees waived under a community service clause for veterans, Deborah handed him 3 new collars. Black, sturdy, and lined with soft padding. She slid over a stamping kit so Ethan could engrave the nameplates himself. He etched each one carefully. When he was done, he clipped the tags onto the collars and knelt down in the parking lot, outside where the dogs sat waiting in the back of a borrowed station wagon. One by one, he placed the collars on them. Rex stood proudly, chest out, tail stiff, ears high. Brutus leaned in gently, licking Ethan's wrist with a tenderness that belied his strength. Duke wagged his tail softly, head tilted as if he could hear the unspoken promises being made. That evening, the 4 of them walked through Bay Ridge like they'd always belonged there. Bay Ridge was a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of West Ham, a mix of coastal cottages and modest homes that lined the bluffs above the water. Ethan had inherited a small bungalow from an uncle he barely knew, a man who'd fished for a living and drank too much but left his house in decent shape. It had 2 bedrooms, a patchy lawn, and a backyard that opened onto a trail leading to the cliffs. Each morning began the same now. Ethan rose at dawn, slipped on his worn running shoes, and opened the front door. Rex always darted ahead, the leader. Brutus, despite his limp, kept pace with Duke, who had filled out in the weeks since his rescue, muscles knitting back into place beneath his sleek black coat. Together they trotted past coffee shops opening their awnings, along the boardwalk lined with seagull prints, through the park where joggers paused to watch. Neighbors began to learn their names. A barista named Charlie always left out a bowl of water outside his cart. A retired teacher named Mrs. Lyman waved from her porch swing each time the group passed. "Your boys look stronger every day," she would say. And it was true. But it wasn't just the dogs who changed. Ethan changed too. He no longer slept with one eye open. He no longer flinched when a door creaked in the night, or when thunder rolled across the bay. He spoke to the dogs as if they could answer, and in a way, they did. In their eyes, their presence, their unflinching loyalty. One late afternoon, Ethan took them to the beach. It was the golden hour, when the sun dipped low and painted everything in amber. The tide was out, exposing rippled sand and sea glass glinting like forgotten treasure. The dogs ran free, Brutus splashing, Duke chasing seabirds, Rex pacing the tide line like a watchman. Ethan sat on the rocks near the dune grass, arms around his knees. His body relaxed in a way he hadn't felt in years. The breeze carried the scent of salt and pine, and something faintly floral, wild rosemary that grew near the bluffs. He looked out at the water, then down at the 3 shapes circling back toward him. They came in slowly, breath steaming, fur dusted with sand. Rex sat beside him first, pressing into his leg. Brutus lay down heavily, sighing. Duke curled close and dropped a shell at his feet. A gift. Ethan smiled, the kind of smile that comes not from amusement, but from deep, unshakable gratitude. He thought about that night. The rain, the alley, the sound of claws on wet pavement, the bark that broke through the darkness. He thought of the moment the glass shattered, the rope fell, and life returned. All of it was blurry now, like the outline of a dream. But what remained sharp, crystalline, was the knowledge that they had chosen each other. Not because of blood or duty, but because of loyalty. Because of the kind of trust that can't be earned with commands or treats, but forged in danger and kept in silence. "You found me," Ethan whispered. Rex licked his hand. "You stayed." Duke rested his head in Ethan's lap. "And you're still here." Brutus gave a low, contented grunt, eyes half closed as waves lapped the shore. The sun melted into the horizon. The sky turned bruised purple and orange. The world quieted. And there, on the sand, surrounded by 3 dogs who had once been lost like him, Ethan realized he wasn't just a man with a home, he had a family. Sometimes God sends angels not in robes, but in fur and paw prints. In the darkest alleys of life, when all seems lost, he whispers hope through the bark of a loyal companion or the outstretched hand of a stranger. Ethan thought he was rescuing 3 dogs, but in truth, they were sent to rescue him. This story reminds us that family isn't always who we're born to, but who stands beside us when the storm comes. Miracles often arrive quietly, wrapped in mud and scars, and sometimes they walk on 4 legs. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little light today. Comment Amen if you believe that God still works in mysterious, beautiful ways, even through dogs, and may He bless everyone watching with courage, comfort, and companionship. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more true stories that restore faith in the goodness around us. Until next time, may God bless you and guide your path.